Okay, let's talk about ISO. ISO stands for International Standards Organization. It's a feature on your digital SLR camera that will determine how sensitive your light sensor is to light. Of course, just like every other setting on your camera, it will impact the end physical image as well, or the file format in this case. So, an introduction to ISO. On the back of the camera, somewhere, you should have a button that says ISO. Hitting the button, pressing the button, will tell you what ISO setting you're currently using. On my Nikon D90, the image is displayed on the upper right-hand LED screen. On other cameras, it may be displayed on the back of the camera, or in some models, you may see the ISO either in addition to the interior viewfinder, or sometimes only in the interior viewfinder. So, I'm going to hit ISO, or press it lightly, and it currently tells me that my ISO setting is 3200. It's a very high ISO setting, meaning that my camera, right now the sensor, is extremely sensitive to light. It would take very little light to make an accurate exposure. I can adjust the ISO, moving it down to, let's say, 200, a nice low ISO setting, meaning that to get an accurate exposure within my camera on the light sensor there, I'm going to need more light than I would at an ISO of 3200. So why not just always use a high ISO, guaranteeing fast shutter speeds and making the most of available light? Well, with every positive, there's a negative, and vice versa. In the case of ISO, a high ISO does allow you to shoot in low light situations. Indoors, concerts, at dusk, dark, etc. So it certainly comes in handy. However, what you trade off in exchange for the high ISO setting is digital noise. Digital noise occurs in the digital file format. It makes the image, in very simple terms here, not getting too complex, it makes it fuzzy. It'll sometimes include artifacts of color, digital noise, specks of color that shouldn't be there. This is a result of the camera's sensitivity to light, increasing it to a hypersensitive setting like 3200. Now when you decrease that setting to an ISO of something along the lines of 200 or 100, maybe 50, what you do is the light sensor needs more light to make an accurate exposure. It's great for daylight. It's great for doing really long exposures where there's not ample light. So you may be shooting at night and you may want a long exposure, and so therefore you don't want to increase the sensitivity to 3200. You'd rather leave it at 100, guaranteeing an exposure that may run into the minutes. With a low ISO setting, you get very little digital noise. In other words, you get a nice, crisp, clean, clear image. Generally speaking, you always want to use the lowest available ISO setting you can while still maintaining a fast shutter speed and the desired aperture setting. So have fun with ISO. We'll take a look at two images. One was shot at an ISO of 200 and one was shot with an ISO of 3200. Things I want you to look for when we look at these images are things like the color saturation. We'll see that there's a difference between a low ISO setting and a high ISO setting, and the digital noise. We're going to zoom into these images and really see the impact of that noise on the printed image. Sometimes that noise isn't as readily accessible or easy to see on the back of an LCD or even on a computer screen. But the print format really lets that noise, or really makes that noise apparent. So be careful with the ISO setting. Unless you're looking for a high-grain, high-noise image, try to keep that ISO setting as low. Here are the two photographs we just got through making. The image on the left was shot with a low ISO setting, in this case an ISO of 200. The image on the right was shot with a high ISO setting, in this case an ISO of 3200. Notice the color saturation is greater on the image with a low ISO setting, and notice that the image shot with a high ISO setting appears to be slightly flatter, less intense colors. Now let's zoom in a bit and see what the difference makes upon closer inspection. Now the image on the left we can see has a greater range of color and slightly more contrast than the image on the right. The image on the left again was shot with an ISO of 200 while the image on the right was shot with an ISO of 3200. Now let's zoom in just a bit more and pay attention to the text. That'll really show us the difference between the high ISO and low ISO settings. Now we've zoomed in to really emphasize the difference between the high and low settings of ISO. Focus on the text that reads star flash just beneath the lens. The image on the left, shot with a low ISO setting of 200, is much more crisp and clearer than the image on the right, which has a slightly fuzzy quality to it. In print, the fuzziness would be amplified, and we would definitely be able to distinguish the difference between the image shot with a low ISO and a high ISO setting. All right, that's enough on ISO. If you have any questions, please let me know via email or through the course discussion or classroom. Thank you. Bye-bye.